Hello again, Tesla Cats. This is Tesla-chan, or Lucy if you prefer, and welcome back to the garden. Now, once again, this series will be an ongoing series until the fanfiction is over, but will otherwise not be my typical content on this channel going forward. Please remember that viewer discretion is advised, as this is creepypasta, therefore horror. And by extension, there will be mentions of murder, blood, death, and destruction. Again, viewer discretion is advised. All images used in this video belong to their previous owners and are not my own creation. On top of that, any other images that appear in this video are in the public domain and are able to be used by anybody at any time. As a final note, I know last time I recorded I said that part 3 was the last part. I haven't written the next part as of recording this particular video. So if you have any mentions of creepypastas you would like to be incorporated in Hunters of Ryzoth, or better yet, if you have any suggestions for this series going forward, please leave a comment down below and I will see what I can do about utilizing the characters you recommend. And I will consider being the operative word, using people's original characters if they want. That's a big if, however, as of right now, as I still have a lot of story I want to tell. With that out of the way, welcome back to Hunters of Ryzoth, and I'll see you at the very end to tell you a bit more about what the series is going to be like going forward. Hunters of Ryzoth, Chapter 2, Trust Isn't Given, It's Earned. The next morning came almost too quickly, as demonic espion cries filled the house. Silver shot up, awakened by the loud noises, but more so annoyed that he had been woken up at all. He forced himself out of the dusty bed he had been allowed to use last night, and he marched himself out into the hallway to see an angry E sharpening his claws on the hardwood floor, before crying out in anger again. Silver tried to talk to him, only to be ignored. Silver grit his teeth upon hearing the same cry that woke him up echoing in his ears once more. But before he could yell at him, he felt a tugging on his ripped shorts. The unknown closest to his head at the time cried calmly to get him to look down. Loneliness was right next to what used to be his leg, and he heaved a sigh. His phantom limbs appeared once more as he knelt down for the sad-looking Evie. "Okay, so what's going on?" Silver asked tiredly, reaching his newly formed hand up to rub the bridge of his nose. "She's not here," Loneliness stated in a matter-of-factly tone, laced with concern. "She wasn't here when we both woke up about 6 hours ago, and she isn't back now." Silver blinked in shock as E stalked his way over to join their conversation. "For all we know, she was working with them to capture us." E switched his tail in front of his paws as he sat down. "So pardon me for not being the conversation type." Silver gave him a slight glare as if to tell him to stop. E huffed, looking away in anger. "Okay," Silver sighed, agitation now geared towards Nova. "We need to prepare for the worst. I'll keep an eye out for her and any hunters. You guys grab the stuff so we can leave. And prepare for a potential fight, too." Both Evies nodded before taking off in two separate directions in the house. Silver sent some of his unknowns to stay with them and help, before heading towards the door to keep watch. He silently watched the front door, nearest to the window, through the nearest window. He silently watched the front door that they had entered through the nearest window, watching for any dangers so he could warn the other two. 2 minutes had passed, and then 3, when he saw Nova coming back. What surprised, and even bothered him more, was that she had tons of bags in her hand. Some bags were made of burlap, while others looked like plain plastic. He marched towards the door in anger, allowing E and Loneliness to hear. As she opened the door, Silver stood a foot back from the door, giving her a cross look. Before he could even speak, E growled out, "Where the fuck were you, hey, traitor?" Nova paused. Now in the middle of pulling the bags inside, confusion plagued her mind. From the moment she had entered the door, she had wondered why Silver was watching and now glaring at her. With part of their stance made clear by E, she wondered what she had done wrong. "I'm sorry, what?" she asked, letting go of the bag that she had been pulling in when the question had been asked. "You heard me," E doubled down, almost emanating a cry as he did so. Silver jumped in at this point, with a similar tone, his voice filling with whispers. "Where were you, ratting us out to the hunters?" Loneliness only had his back to her, making the Aster very agitated. "I just went out shopping," she said, her voice being numb and even as she responded to them. "I woke up this morning and checked the fridge. When I did, I noticed I didn't have much in terms of food, so I left to get some." She could barely keep herself from snapping at the group when Lonely chimed in, turning around as he did so. "You were gone for 6 hours! Shopping doesn't take that long!" She nearly facepalmed when Silver began to speak again. "We just met you. Do you expect us to believe that? You know, if I'm about to get the whole trust is earned, it's not given spiel, I'm aware!" she snapped, cutting the boys off in the middle of his rant. "I didn't want to wake you guys up because we all had a long night. For one. For two, the place I went to is not only far from the house, but because I don't always have money to give, I'm able to pay for the stuff I get by doing them favors. And three, if I'm a traitor selling you out to the hunters, you'd think I'd be smart enough not to give myself away this quickly, wouldn't you?" Silence cut through the air almost instantly after those words left her mouth. Not because there was a sudden trust between them, but because there wasn't. They all stood in a strange staring contest, with no one changing course for several minutes. Nova had finally calmed down enough to quickly scoop up the rest of the bags and place them in the kitchen. She began putting stuff away herself, occasionally feeling for the bottle of bone dust in the front pocket of her hoodie that she had brought with her when she left. Not 2 seconds after she started, did the others join her in the kitchen. Probably to make sure she hadn't purchased poison of some sort. She wanted to gripe and whine about this. But a part of her knew, or at least expected, that she might be confronted by them when she got back. Murderers, ghosts, monsters, game characters, as long as you were there to cause fear online, you were a pasta. With that in mind, this also left plenty of room for distrust, as many creepypastas were murderous, not too unlike herself. Lying had never been off the table, so she knew why they were acting like this. But it didn't make it feel any less infuriating. She had placed a few bags to the side as they weren't for the kitchen. She sighed, glad to have everything put away, when Silver, E, and Lonely apologized. Nova only shook her head. "You had every right. I should have told you what I was doing." There was once again silence. She knew they only half meant their shared apology. She didn't let it get to her, though, choosing to accept that it was the better option, as she didn't want to cause any unneeded trouble. She stretched, feeling like this situation was just getting worse the longer she was there. She sighed, going up to her room without a word to the others. She could feel them watching her as she walked up the stairs and down the newly scratched hallway up. smoothly scratched up hallway. She heard them begin to talk as she walked past the room she let Silver use, before plopping down on the bed in her room. The room was a soft gray color all around. The wallpaper had been worn by the years as nearly no pattern was left anymore. She started taking deep breaths to calm herself further, so she wasn't as angry. And as she did, she felt sharp pains fill her body. "Damn it," she muttered, still feeling pain from being stabbed last night. She then pulled out the bottle of bone dust and studied it for a moment. The bottle was surprisingly intricate, a crystal-like look and colored in a gentle pink. Its cap was a gold-silver color, having detailed engravings work done on the cap to dress it up nicely. The bone dust inside had a milky hue and almost looked like white sand. She cautiously opened the bottle, watching the dust move ever so slightly as the bottle opened. "I don't understand," she breathed out in awe. "Why you can heal me when I can't heal myself during the day. But I enjoy the sacrifice of whoever this belonged to nonetheless." She then proceeded to pour the dust into her mouth, crunching it between her teeth and savoring the odd flavor. She knew that she would never return home anyway, so knowing that this would have been taboo or was taboo by human standards didn't bother her anymore. As this took place, Silver, E, and Loneliness were studying the bags that Nova had left out. "What's this shit?" E asked, looking at the bags left on the counter. Silver shook his head, not sure what to make of it either, only to have Loneliness speak up. "We could bring it into her living room and look at it. Not like we're taking off with it, so to speak." "Jeez," E replied. "I thought I was supposed to be the reckless one, not you." Lonely was about to retort when Silver said, "No, we need to make sure she doesn't have anything to stab us in the back with." E, Lonely, and the unknown seemed to understand his sentiment, so he grabbed the two bags and laid them on the old coffee table in the living room. They stared at the two bags for a minute before Silver opened up one. Inside of the bag was several small blue crystal bottles with a strange liquid inside. When opened, none of them felt threatened by the contents, though they weren't quite sure why, considering the fact that they didn't even know what it was. Next in the bag was some sort of book explaining techniques for using electronics and static for fighting, transport, etc. Silver's eyes lit up with excitement at the prospect of being able to do what Ben and even E could do. Loneliness bounced up a little to get Silver's attention. When he looked over, E was giving a look. "This stuff teaches how to travel through the electronics that you and Ben do," Silver started, getting a look of awe from Lonely. E stalked over, jumping under the couch behind him to look at the book. "Wait," he said, realizing that Silver was telling the truth. "Why would she get this? She can't do that." "Maybe we were wrong?" Loneliness chimed in, jumping under the couch next to Silver. None of them were sure about that quite yet. There were a few more books about similar abilities in that same bag. They studied the books with interest and almost in awe of all the information. But they still didn't know what the other stuff was. Then they opened bag number 2. Inside were knives and different weapons of different kinds. Some even had symbols of different kinds. They figured that each weapon had been made in a specialized way for each of them. Silver was especially drawn to a ball that looked similar to a Pokemon ball. None of them could tell what it was for, but it was interesting to say the least. As they were about to look through the books again, they heard Nova coming back downstairs. They rushed to put things away when they heard her chuckle. "You know that stuff is for you guys, right?" she asked, her head turned over towards them just past the stairs. None of them replied. She gave them a small sigh before saying, "Well, that stuff is indeed for you. I just wanted to make sure you could defend yourselves." Again, silence. But at least they looked like they were letting go of the prior events. She went to go make something to eat for everyone, knowing if she hadn't actually eaten anything, they hadn't either. The rest of the day continued with awkward glances and complete silence between Nova and the Pokepastas. Nova knew things would take time, but she didn't shake the fact that she had a job to complete. The next day. "Hey, Silver, we're clear on the plan, right?" Loneliness asked, despite not being completely sure about E's plan after they had all gone to bed. "You're not sure about it, are ya?" Silver asked, almost laughing despite his exhaustion. "I'm not. If she's really a hunter in disguise, then won't we just end up fighting her anyway? She could be like the others, you know." Silver nodded. "But if we don't, we won't know for sure either." With that, the group finally went to sleep. The next morning, Silver was awoken by a gentle nudging. Lonely was pawing at his side with a look that told him all that he needed to know. When he left the room, he saw E already waiting for them at the top of the steps. He wasn't growling. He didn't make a sound, only nodding down the stairs as his way of telling them that Nova was about to leave again. Meanwhile, downstairs, Nova was grabbing her hoodie and the broken black hole mask that she had from the other night. She even was grabbing a backpack for some extra essentials. As she popped the mask into her backpack and turned to head towards the door, she saw Silver, E, and the unknowns blocking her way. "We're going with you today," Silver said firmly, "whether you like it or not." Nova could feel her agitation rise once more, and similar to yesterday's. However, two things crossed her mind. One, she would probably have done the same thing given the circumstance. And two, having them join her wouldn't actually hinder her during this job. "All right," she said in a tired and annoyed voice. "That said, we all have a long walk ahead of us." Silver and the others seemed somewhat relieved, but also somewhat worried about this answer. Silver just sighed, thanking her, to which Nova nodded. As they were leaving the house, they ended up being able to see an area surrounding the house. It seemed like they were in the center of a small clearing, with miles of trees rimming the outside of that clearing. They all ended up frozen there for a second, as they had never even thought to really pay attention to the outside since they had been there. "You guys coming, or?" Nova suddenly asked, pulling the group out of their collective daze. She was already at the edge of the clearing on the main trail, and seemed to end at the house. Silver ran over, his unknowns following him closely. E and Loneliness followed just behind them. When they finally caught up, Nova cut off any snide remarks from them by turning on her heels to face the path. "I could have just left," she said coolly. "I didn't, though, because I'm not going back on our agreement." The group fell almost silent, with E cursing under his breath at her. Eventually his complaints fell silent as they continued down the winding trail. They were in the woods for what felt like an eternity, and the place had a hazy feel to it. Fog coming and going in random intervals, and some diverging paths that others would have taken had Nova not been ignoring them entirely. The trail ended at a street, cutting off the whole thing, with no visible continuation on the other side. Nova paused, looking back and forth at the street before speaking to them again. On the other side is a short stint of additional woodland, and then we'll be in a major town for the next 30 minutes. Make sure you have a hiding spot or a disguise of some sort, as people don't like things they don't understand. Sure thing, Silver said, already semi-prepared from being taught once a long time ago. E seemed to tisk in annoyance, planning to hide in Silver's hoodie once they got there. It was unfortunate that Lonely and the Unknowns had the same plan, as he was now left stuck. He looked at Silver, then back at Nova before seeing the navy backpack and groaning. He pushed on Nova's leg with his paw, getting her to turn to him. At first, he looked away, but then noticed that her searing gaze wasn't going anywhere. Nova's mouth opened slightly before he asked, "You okay if I hide in your bag? If not, fine by me." Nova smiled, watching his face twist in agitation at the prospect of asking a potential traitor for help. That said, she knelt down, moving a few things around in her bag before opening it wide enough for him to step inside. E gave her a look of cautious anger before getting in. As he got comfortable, Nova carefully closed the backpack most of the way, mostly trying to avoid hurting him with the zippers. She turned her head upon finishing, getting ready to ask Silver if he needed help, only to see him taking the form of his character pre-death, of course. "Guess I didn't need to ask," she said, watching Loneliness move around in the front pocket of his hoodie. She even saw the Unknowns adjusting into the hood of his hoodie briefly before Silver said with a semi-confident smile, "Yeah, a couple of other gaming pastas taught me how to do this, just in case." Nova just nodded, carefully swinging the bag over her shoulders so as not to hurt E. As they walked through the town, people would occasionally stop them to get pictures with Silver in his trainer cosplay before they would continue once more. As soon as they were leaving the more populated areas of town, there was a tension filling Silver's chest. E would struggle in the backpack trying to find a more comfortable position, much to the slight annoyance of Nova. Loneliness would peek out of Silver's pocket every once in a while, and wondered what would be out this far away from people. Then they stopped in a place that seemed like a dead end, in a seemingly abandoned parking garage. Silver, for once, was pissed. He figured now that he had a right to worry, and was about to curse her out when something changed. Nova formed a ball of blue light above her hand and aimed it at part of the wall. Silver freaked, thinking that she was going to destroy the wall with the ball of light. But then, a large door appeared, now filled with symbols and characters, all of them emitted the same color of light. "The hell?" Silver asked, only to see Nova's shoulders shake with a little laughter. Then she had claws made of the same light appear on the tips of her fingers on her right hand. She slowly slid the claws between some of the barely visible slots in the round door, causing the glowing symbols to get a little brighter before she removed her claws. The door rolled away to the left very slowly, revealing a long concrete-encased hallway, with light and noise on the other side. "Are you ready to get out of my bag?" she asked, looking over her shoulder as her bag shifted again. "Of course, it's stuffy in here," moaned E from inside. Loneliness wriggled out of Silver's pocket, and the Unknowns returned to their rightful place, floating around Silver. Nova set down her backpack, unzipping it to let him out, and E stretched. He was trying to get some feeling back in his paws. "Okay," Nova said, making sure they were listening before she continued. "This place isn't normal, granted, neither are we, but this isn't like your typical creepypasta territory. With that said, I'll let you experience this place a little bit for yourselves before I lay down any rules." They all seemed a bit confused by this revelation, but they followed her down the hallway, the door closing behind them slowly as they walked closer to the light, and they heard massive amounts of commotion. Some stuff sounded familiar to them, while other things didn't. It was only when they passed the end of the hallway that they could see what was making so much noise. There were kids running around. Some looked like demons, while others the groups weren't even sure about. That said, Nova recognized elves, demons, wendigos, ghosts, fairies, etc. in every single cage, shop, and customers even. Now, let me tell you the rules here, Nova said, causing the Pokepastas to look at her. 1. Your creepypasta status does not hold weight here. As creepypastas don't know about this little black market, so they don't do business here. 2. Don't pick a fight with people. People will take advantage of that, and if you cause trouble. 3. Try not to engage with the shopkeepers. They're more than a little persistent out here than any other shop I've been to. And finally, 4. Stick close to me. I've made a good reputation for myself out here over the past 2 years or so. People will be less likely to mess with you because of that. They all seemed to nod. Then he asked, Wait, you got all that stuff here, and you still had to come back? Nova nodded. I'm able to pay for things by doing favors for the shopkeepers, within reason, anyway. I had a job from an owner in a local tavern, and I wasn't able to do that yesterday. Plus, Silas and I have a close relationship. He sees me as an additional member of the family, and so I don't really feel like I can ignore him. Then, a loud screeching sound pierced the air. Silver, E, and Loneliness drew much closer to Nova. She almost laughed as they seemed to circle around her for protection. The unknowns seemed to glare at her before Silver added, Hey, not funny! This only served to make Nova actually laugh more before saying, It's only funny because the first time I had been at this little black market, I did the same. There was probably just a fight breaking out between a banshee and one of the witches out here. E and Silver grumbled, backing up a little bit in annoyance. Lonely stuck by her feet, still being pretty freaked out by this huge new place. Fairies flew by them, seeming to investigate the group as they walked along. Tomes for magic! Cried one shop owner desperately, causing E and Silver to get closer to Nova once more. Fresh meat! A demonic voice chimed in, causing Lonely to nearly jump into Nova's arms. Nova began to pet the shaking Eevee as they got closer to a more central hub within the market. At the very center of this hub was a rustic-looking tavern. There were a few tables outside, each looking like a circular, metal-rimmed wooden shield. They were supported by the same metal that rimmed the tables and stood on a single pole and foot. The name of the tavern was written in 3 or more languages that seemed to flip around depending on who was reading. Silas's Demon Alehouse, Silver muttered, seeming to be in awe of the inviting-looking building. Yep, Nova said, still petting Loneliness on the head. Silas takes pride in making everyone feel welcome. That includes the sign there. So that's why I can read it? He asked in surprise, only to suddenly look away out of jealousy towards Lonely. Loneliness looked at E and then at the tavern. Please tell me we're going in there, he said, starting to shake. Nova nodded, only to add an additional confirmation to her statement. Yep, that's where Silas is, so don't worry. They all scurried into the tavern, noticing the stark difference between the market outside and the inside of the tavern. People were talking calmly. Casual conversation made the place almost feel like a normal, human restaurant. I'll be right with you, a raspy demonic voice seemed to chime through the place. Just take a seat anywhere. Nova seemed to smile. She gently set down Loneliness, who seemed much more calm. I'm here on business, but my friends and I can sit for a spell, Nova said, earning a chuckle from the voice. The people and creatures looked towards her, like they recognized her by voice alone. Some smiled, Others waved at her, while more still playfully pushed her. The dynamics seemed to fall into place as they made their way into the empty booth, in an empty space of the tavern. "So, what is this place?" Lilianus asked. "And how can you endure all that stuff outside? I mean, you said it was like a black market, but..." Silver E and the Unknowns looked at Nova for explanation. "I call it a black market because they sell things out there that most markets like this one don't. Or that other markets just won't touch. This particular market is actually called Elf Forest, as it was started by a few dark elves over a couple of 100 years ago. You can find anything from magic spells to information, that is, if you can pay for it. The sellers and people who frequent this place do live by some sort of code, so nothing passes through here that is world-ending. That said, not everything sold is ethical either, but generally the people here are decent. I won't say the place isn't jarring for a first-timer. The general bustle takes some getting used to." "You were shaking like a leaf the first time you came in here, kiddo," the raspy demonic voice chimed in. "You tried to play it off, but I could tell you were freaked out too. Granted, you did find this place by accident." "Silas! Good to see you, old man!" Nova exclaimed it lightly. Looking at Silas, one could see a set of intense-looking gray eyes. He had large, twisted-looking horns that pointed behind him, with ruddy red scales that dotted his pale yellow skin. He was a little chubby, and appeared to have a few years on him. Silas laughed. Her comments were nothing new to him at this point. "You too, kiddo. Now, did I have a job for you?" Nova nodded, causing the others to watch their interaction carefully. "Before we begin, would you and your friends like a meal on the house?" Nova nodded, and shortly after they ordered, their food showed up. Nova smiled. "Okay, so fill me in. What do you need from me, old man?" "It's kind of a big job, which brings me to why you had so many jobs yesterday." Silas replied kindly. "It's something my dad brought up for me a little over 2 weeks ago," she admitted. "I needed to be able to get into contact with some operators. Long story short, I hoped I'd be able to get some info. That and these guys are staying at my place, and I wanted to make sure I had groceries. And something to help them with fighting due to the info I got from Dad. Sorry about not getting to your job yesterday." Silas shook his head, seeming to be okay, knowing that Nova wasn't just one to turn down a job if she could do it. "So these 3 are creepypastas as well, kiddo?" Silas asked. Nova nodded, introducing each of them to Silas, and then explaining why they were with her. "Ah, that makes sense, especially with your specific group. Hunters have gotten a bit more nuts, and those collars sound familiar," Silas replied, rubbing his temples. Nova nodded in agreement. Then they both seemed to remember the reason she was actually there. "Right, the job," Silas said, a new expression crossing his face. "People around here have noticed a disturbing trend. One of our local auction houses has been selling people, live people, as well as lesser beings, workers from shops, and regulars. The thing is, none of us were here to raise a hand against the head of the auction house. He would find a way to make us pay. As it stands, he took my daughter and is planning on selling her today. So my job is for you to kill him. I know that everyone else is too terrified, and you don't shy away from any job, so..." Nova stared in disbelief, surprised that anything this taboo by the people who worked there would happen. She sighed. "Smaller branch or the trunk?" "The trunk," Silas admitted sheepishly. "That's why people out here are so freaked. This job comes at a hefty price, you know," Nova admitted. "We can work out the details as we're relatively close. I know we'll work things out." Hunters involved? Silas shook his head. There is another regular who's a pasta. He's been missing too, though sources say he was looking into some info on a similar problem when he went missing. That, and I think Mr. Winters was the last person he talked to, so he might be there too. She smirked, her black hole-like eyes gaining a mischievous glow to them. You know, I'd be pretty pissed for you dragging me into all these things that could get me killed, if we weren't so close. Silas laughed, playfully hitting her back. The group finished their food with Silas offering to make keys for Silver, E, and Loneliness to come back whenever they wanted to. She made sure it was something that they wanted, and made part of his payment for the job, as they seemed genuinely interested. Once they had finished eating, Silas urged them to hurry, as Corin, Mr. Winters, would begin his auction soon. Don't worry, Silas, Nova said, pulling her broken mask from her bag. We'll be back faster than you can blink. Good luck, kiddo, he cried, as she headed back into the market they had left behind. So, do we have a plan? Silver whispered into her ears. None of us have been here before. Lonely started to freak out a bit, only to have E walk up next to him to comfort him. We'll play to our strengths, Nova says. E is the best fighter in your group, so he'll run offense outside of myself. You and Loneliness both have skills good for distractions, as well as inducing fear. So you'll be in charge of keeping people from catching up to us or catching on before we want them to. I like this plan. E seemed to let his demonic tone fill with delight. With that said, Lonely added, I can use some of my curses to make people see things that aren't there. Silver smiled, his void eyes gaining a red glow. I can use that as an advantage to send the unknowns all over the place. Nova appreciated their optimism, even if she couldn't tell if they actually trusted her or not. They approached the Bluebell, with optimism being replaced with focus and tension. I'll get us our ticket inside, Nova said. We need to remain discreet for now. The group nodded as she conversed with the man at the front door. The group stood a little ways away until Nova waved them over casually. You know you're the only person I'd allow to do this before an auction, right? An overly pompous yet proper-sounding voice stated as Silver, E, and Loneliness approached. Let alone would I have ever let them inside if you weren't their friend. Nova gave a kind laugh as Silver rounded the corner with his unknowns, and the other two in tow. The auction house was seemingly out of the only white building one could see, and the inside was extremely extravagant and posh-looking. Silver, E, Loneliness, this is Corin Winters, and he's agreed to let us explore, Nova said with a wink, letting them know that this was their target. Silver faked a smile, making sure to shake hands with him. Nice to meet you, Mr. Winters. The pleasure's mine, boy. He spoke, seeming to enunciate the word boy purposefully. Silver felt like his skin was crawling after meeting this icy individual. He was covered in black veins and blue skin, and had pitch-colored eyes. He wore an expensive-looking suit and had long white hair pulled back into a low ponytail. His pointed ears gave him away as some sort of elf, but his disdain for others was almost painfully obvious. It's nice to meet you, Mr. Winters, Loneliness said from next to Nova's legs. E seemed trying to gauge their target when the man looked down at both of him and Loneliness curiously. Those two could fetch a good price, given the right buyer, he said, his voice seeming to be semi-lost in thought. They're not for sale, Nova and Silver said in an odd unison. Corin looked at both of them, giving a slight ignored expression before focusing his venom on Nova. Now, Miss Nova, you can't just bring prime real estate with you and expect me not to make an assessment. Silver looked as though he was about to snap. His deathly figure looked like it was beginning to bleed anew. When he opened his mouth to retort, he was shocked when heat filled the area that they stood in. Then Nova spoke up. "Corin Winters," Nova said with a voice that sounded deathly cold. "I told you in advance that these were my friends that I was inviting. In no capacity did I tell you I was bringing a product to sell. So there is no need for any real estate assessment. I'd suggest biting down on your tongue hard, or there will be reason for a damage assessment." A blue glow engulfed her, and Corin suddenly looked horrified. And if one were to look closer, they would notice him looking at her eyes, and that they were reflecting in his. Corin cleared his throat, suddenly looking away from him. "You're right, absolutely right, forgive me." His apology was abrupt, like the ability to form a more formal apology had been shot. Nova nodded, seeming to barely be able to control her rage. "With that said..." Corin nodded. "Yes, I did agree that you could get first crack before the auctions began. This way, please." Corin seemed to speed away, leaving Silver to ask, "You okay?" Nova nodded, her eyes becoming more gentle as she looked over at him. "Yeah, I'll be even better when I can kill him." "Damn straight!" he growled, almost yipping in the process. Loneliness looked at Silver for comfort. "I hate him." Silver petted him and asked, "So, how do we attack this?" Nova saw Corin waiting and mumbled, "You guys explore the main area and distract any workers from heading to the back. E, you stick with me and keep your cool. I'm gonna struggle with that too, so don't worry." Silver nodded, seeming to lead Lonely down an opposite hallway while E and Nova walked over to Corin. He now refused to look E in the eye when addressing the two of them. "Shall we then?" Nova nodded, causing Corin to speed forward once again. E was barely suppressing a growl as they made their way to storage. Corin kept trying to shoot apologetic looks at E, only for such apologies to be outright ignored. When they were just outside the storage room, Nova looked at Corin. He hastily opened the door and said, "Shall I show you today's offerings?" "I'll be right in," Nova said. "Just give me a moment to calm my friend." Corin nodded and scrambled inside, leaving the door slightly ajar for her. "So I'd bring you along, but," Nova said. He nodded, only saying, "Don't worry, I can take my anger out on any pompous assholes that don't have a problem with what he's doing." Nova almost laughed, wishing him good luck as she followed Corin inside. Corin almost looked relieved, seeing that it was just Nova. While they walked through the room, Nova took note of every cage, box, and crate. There were aqua dragons, lesser demons, younger than Silas was, phantoms, children, young adults of the human variety. Every person or creature she could see or either looked confused or scared, betrayed, angry, or all of the above. Nova paused a couple times, looking at some specific cages. Silas's daughter was sitting towards the back. Her purple eyes glowed dimly in a dimly lit area she was being housed in. Another place she paused was in front of a cage with a man in it. His outfit looked a bit messy, but he had bright golden colored eyes, gray skin, and his pants were shackled so that no one could see his hands. She somehow recognized him as the puppeteer, and it enraged her. The final pause she made was in front of her purchase, a dog-looking creature. She was instantly drawn to it. The dog had its skeleton on the outside with purple fur underneath it. Its eyes were a piercing green color, and it had multiple sets of razor-sharp teeth. It barked harshly, growling and sounding like hundreds of dogs barking all at once. "Ah," Corn said. He had long since slipped back into his typical persona. "The Blaze Hound! You have wonderful tastes. If you can train the bitch." The Blaze Hound barked louder, being riled up by Corin even speaking. Nova wanted to kill him right there and then, but it was too risky. The workers were in charge of keeping things clean, and she had seen several in their walkthroughs so far. So she did something that would even scare Corin, and put her hand between the bars of the cage. Corin, who had been laughing at the Blaze Hound's enraged barks, now went deathly silent. The Blaze Hound froze, staring at Nova in a level of surprise before even sniffing her hand. It sniffed her intently, trying to gauge what she was smelling on her hand. And then she proceeded to happily lick the fingers like a normal dog would, causing Nova to giggle. The Blaze Hound let out a calm bark before it leaned its skull against her hand. Nova petted her for a bit before saying, "I think Ember and I will get along just fine, Corin." She removed her hand from the cage slowly, and as she stood, she noticed that Corin looked pale. "Miss Nova, I'd urge you to be more careful. That said, we'll head to my office and we can fill out the paperwork." Corin said, giving her a stern look, "Would you like a worker to collect her for you?" Nova shook her head, giving him a victorious smile. "No, I'll collect her myself. That said, I wouldn't agitate the beings you sell if you don't want people to be reckless." Corin turned on his heels and headed towards his office. Nova was preparing to kill the moment the door to his office closed. Meanwhile, Silver and Loneliness were exploring the halls of Bluebell. They would occasionally run into one of the workers. Although Lonely had been brushing his fluffy tail against the wall and imbuing them with curses, many people would just run at the sight of Silver. "So, what do we do if we have to run damage control?" Loneliness asked. Another worker scurried past them in fear. Silver smiled, looking over at the impatient Evie. "Don't worry, we'll get a chance, and when we do, we'll turn it up to an 11. Lonely seemed to jump excitedly at this prospect, causing a soft chuckle from Silver while they walked around. They would hear some of the workers talking, most of them in extremely hushed tones. "What's he doing? What he's doing is wrong, though," Silver and Loneliness both heard from just behind them. "We can't fight him, though," the other voice snapped. "Besides, he sold your sister last week because of this. And now he's let some strange magical beings into the auction house." "I heard they're friends of Nova's," the other voice spoke when a girl ran past them down the hall. The girl looked horrified. Her skin was pale and she almost looked sick. "Black Hole, Mr. Winters, dead, killed," the girl said between labored breaths. The others began to ask her what was wrong when Loneliness caused curses to make them see things. Silver smiled, feeling somewhat bad as they didn't seem to agree with their employer's methods. That said, he nodded, and then his unknown scattered to distract other employees. Corin was terrified, seeing the darker side of Nova for the first time on full display. He already had a huge gash in his leg, and it was sizzling and popping. Tears pricked at the corner of his eyes. "You're a friend, so why?" he said, despite the pain ripping through his body. "Oh, Mr. Winters." Her voice was in a sing-songy tone, muffled slightly by her broken mask. "You forfeit that side of me when I found out you were selling your fellow shopkeepers. In fact, you forfeit that when you decided to sell human beings. So let's ask this." Corin tried to freeze her while she buried her claws into him repeatedly. She landed solid punches cloaked in hot radiated fire as he tried to beat her back, his black blood spilling across every inch of the room when she continued. Did your life have value? And did you think these sins would go unpunished? As she finished the final question, she heard him yell briefly before a sickening sound of his skull crushing filled the room. His body was still, and Nova prevented herself from laughing hysterically. His body almost began to look paper white now that he was dead. The screams of his workers sounded as they were either being killed for being okay with his methods, or scared as a distraction. The same could be said for the buyers, who had been waiting patiently in their respective auction rooms. Nova walked past the elves who had died like their employer, and through the groups of terrified people. She now held the keys he had kept in his desk, and proceeded to free every individual whom he had imprisoned for sale. Things became a bit more of a blur between individuals asking her if they should help the humans return home, and animals being called by others who had been imprisoned. By the time things had settled and the shopkeepers had decided who would take over the auction house, it felt like days had passed her by. Eventually, the stage would be ended by a familiar voice calling out to her, "Nova, over here!" Nova looked over, seeing Silver return her gaze with a smile. Nova grinned ear to ear and then felt something brush against her hand. The blaze hound was licking her fingers again, cleaning the blood off of her hands. She giggled a little, petting Ember again. "Come on, girlie, let's go home." Ember barked, following her as she rejoined the pumpkin pastas on the other side of the crowd. Ian looked at the dog following her before saying, "Couldn't resist taking a pet home, could you?" She almost laughed along with Silver at E's comment, while Loneliness sniffed her and tried to make friends. Eventually they all walked back to Silas's tavern, not noticing an individual following them from the auction house. Silas was out front, hugging his daughter tightly when the group approached. "Thank you," Silas cheered upon seeing them. "I see you freed Pup, too." The group turned to see Puppeteer had been following them. "Nice to finally meet," Nova said, breaking the awkward silence that had hit their group. Puppeteer bowed, giving an almost mischievous smile as he did. "I should be thanking you, and the pleasure's mine." His voice was smooth, raspy, and it echoed all at once. Silver sighed, surprised that he was meeting this strange creature, as pastas hardly ever interacted. The only exception to this rule would be when they were working under an operator. "I'm Silver, that's E and Loneliness," Silver said, nodding to the Eevees. "Ah, I've actually heard of you. All of you," he replied. His tone came off as kind. "Though you seem new. But you're different from a lot of us, too." Nova smiled, finally removing the mask from her face. "Where are my manners? I'm Nova. I've been out here for 2 years. "Thank you," Puppeteer said with a calm smile. "All of you. I mean it." Silver smiled, nodding, and overall being surprised that Puppeteer was even this kind. Loneliness managed a tired, cheering cry, and E gave his equivalent to a kind smile, his split tail wrapping around his front paws. "With all things settled," Silas said, sounding a bit more chipper than when this all began, "allow me to give you a quick path home. Oh, and Pup, here." Silas handed Puppeteer a bottle with a drink in it. "When you get the chance, tell me what you think." Silas beamed. "I know you don't drink, so it's not alcohol." Puppeteer chuckled. An almost snake-like smile crossed his face, though all involved could tell it was genuine and kind. "Sure thing, Si," he said in a friendly tone. After a few more moments, Silas had set up a temporary door that started on a path just on the edge of the clearing to Nova's house. They all wished Silas a good day, with a knowing look passing between Nova and Silas before the door closed. "Do you need to rest, Pup?" Nova asked after passing through the door. Puppeteer shook his head, though he did seem to appreciate the offer. "I just want to go home and rest. That said, I think telling people about you could be fun." Puppeteer seemed to grin when mentioning it. "If you don't mind." Nova nodded, almost laughing at his mischievous smirk. "No problems here. Actually, that might be more helpful than you think." Puppeteer gave her a confused look, only to smile and nod before disappearing into the woods from around her house. He had formed golden thread as he walked, seemingly for fun. Then Nova turned to her new pet, Ember, and the other pastas, currently staying with her. "We good?" Silver almost laughed. "We were wrong. Sorry, Nova." "You're all right, I guess," he added. "Just tell us where you're going next time." Loneliness resisted the urge to shoot a glare at E before saying, "We're really sorry, Nova." Ember seemed to generally look back and forth between Nova and the others before she watched her smile. Ember prevented herself from barking with joy when Nova spoke. "Hey, my plan wasn't to hold stuff against you anyway, so no worries. I should have said something the first time." They all seemed to become much calmer. Ember barked happily, earning a laugh from her new owner and friends. As time went on, Nova would spend days practicing with the group. She would willingly let Loneliness and Silver practice jumping in and out of electronics as defense. She taught Silver how to use a knife and what the Pokeball weapons were for. He could imagine a Pokemon and it would briefly appear as an extra defense. E would teach Loneliness the ability Kill, and in return, Loneliness would teach E his form of the ability Curse. They would often go back and forth between Elf Forest and the house for tomes, healing potions, and food when they were running low. None of them had noticed a month had passed, and that it was December 6th. It was about noon when they ended their training session for that day. Nova stretched a little ways away from Silver, E, Lonely, and Ember. "Jeez, she's intense during training," E whined, stretching his paws. "She can be, but she just wants us to be prepared, you know," Loneliness argued, while tiredly stretching. "Don't fight, you guys," Silver said bluntly. "I'm too tired for this." E and Loneliness laughed a bit, and Ember just laid there watching them. She was panting, exhausted from her training herself, but still grateful to be here as opposed to the cages she had been in. Her ear twitched slightly, having heard something. She slowly raised her head. Nova seemed to hear something more, and whipped around with a worried look before a word could leave her lips. She heard a growl, followed by the following sentence. "Spread the word." Everyone froze, seeing a red husky with black markings behind him. And behind him, a taller-looking young man with stitches extending from the corners of his mouth, and a long gray and black striped scarf. The other two were a woman with black hair and a paper white face with a demonic-looking Link. Nova's eyes dimmed just before the attack, and then, with no warning, the group charged. Lou made a break for Nova, only to have Ember pounce in front of him. "Move," he said in a monotone voice, his green eyes looking awfully dull. Ember barked, being careful to read the man in front of her. Lou kicked at her hard, but Ember jumped out of the way just enough to be missed. Then she snapped seemingly at his hand to grab his sleeve and pulled him back hard. Lou seemed to have stumbled for a bit before kicking Ember in the side a few times. Ember could barely feel each kick, but pretended to yipe in pain and fall. Once she could tell his guard was down. Once she could tell his guard was down, and that he was planning to stab her, she jumped up. Her jump was just high enough to overpower him, and she ripped off the collar from his unconscious body. While this was happening, E saw Smile charging for Ember at the same time as Nova. He took the opportunity to go after the demonic mutt, while Nova agreed to let Silver do something. It was when he got up close and dealt a quick slash to the side of Smile's face. "Your souls are mine!" he cried in anger, whipping towards E. "I'd like to see you take my soul! Show me that!" E cried brashly. Just then, Smile grinned sadistically and widely. He charged at E at full speed, not giving E the chance to attack quickly. He repeated the process a few times until Nova kicked Smile in the snout. "Back the fuck off!" she screamed in rage. Smile seemed amused by this, even if there was a methodical look in his eyes, not allowing for all his true emotions to show. "Your blood, your soul, your hate, they're all mine." He chuckled, howls and barks following every word. "Are you prepared, little girl? Are you prepared to spread the word?" Nova tried to fight him off a couple times, only to eventually get overwhelmed by him. He kept snapping at her face, her neck, causing her to put her arms between herself and his teeth. He was trying to kill her for what felt like ages, until his weight was suddenly gone. Nova sat up quickly, seeing Ember next to her, and Smile slowly standing up after appearing to have been rammed into one of the nearby trees. "Leave them! Leave her! You kill them, then I'll torture you!" barked out Ember clearly. Nova seemed surprised to hear her speak. She watched as Smile growled and tried to topple her over, only to be knocked back repeatedly. All the while, Silver had gotten permission to use Nova's phone. His idea had been to keep disappearing into the phone, only to be able to disable Ben in a couple of times with the static. This had worked a few times, despite Silver still struggling a bit with the skill. "You've met a terrible fate, haven't you?" Ben asked, sounding incredibly tired. Silver almost laughed, saying, "Sounds more like you, old friend." With that, he landed a solid right hook to Ben's face, causing him to black out. Silver was just surprised it had been that easy, as he had his unknowns helping out Loneliness. Loneliness had a surprisingly easy fight too, even when he started without Silver's help. Jane seemed to be in a bit of a daze, where she would cry for a little bit, not that any of them knew why. So when Loneliness noticed her become unfocused, the unknowns would float around her, allowing for Lonely to curse to make her tired. She eventually got knocked over by him, and blacked out on impact with the forest floor. It was that when Smile realized they couldn't win that he chose the closest person to him and dragged them back into the woods. That person just so happened to be Jane at the time. As they left, Nova looked at Silver, who seemed to be a bit concerned. "Will Ben be okay?" Silver asked her. Nova smiled, finding his concern to be sweet. Then she answered, "I hope so. We can bring him and Lou back to the house with us. First thing is first, though." Nova knelt down and cut the collar off the boy's neck. She looked back to see Ember very carefully placing Lou on her back and smiled. She smiled, then asked, "Got Ben?" Silver nodded. With the help of E and Loneliness, they were able to get him back to her place. They got the two pastas comfortable and began to plan their next move. Thank you for once again, Tesla Cats, tuning in to another episode of Hunters of Ryzoth. Now, let's kind of explain what I am planning moving forward with this particular series. As you saw, I have used fan arts of different creepypastas. None of them are mine. And quite frankly, even if I was trying to make money off of this series, I am fairly certain it would be very difficult to do so, as YouTube is very picky about what they let get monetized and what they don't. They tend to contradict themselves, and it's just the way that YouTube tends to run. With that in mind, this series is all in good fun and will be running as long as I continue writing the fan fiction Hunters of Ryzoth. So with that in mind, if you have been enjoying the series while reading along, as always, all of the chapters and stuff like that are in the description for you to read yourself. I have obviously ad-libbed some parts of the reading, as the way I wrote it was a little bit convoluted at best. Now, with that said, as I stated at the beginning of this video, I am open to finding out what your favorite creepypastas are, whether or not you have specific creepypasta characters you would like to be used in this series. I'm also open to the idea of doing a Q&A, as I am gonna probably wait to write the next chapter till this episode comes out, and when this episode comes out, it will be officially April the 2nd. I can only handle so much at once, so I will be doing my best to accommodate everyone's requests, and doing my best to write these things properly and not make them cringe. If some of the things come off as cringe, that's fine. If you have any questions as to where references for certain things came from, you can leave them in the description, and I may do a video discussing where certain references come from, what asters are, etc. But you have to ask them in the description. For those of you who have already watched this series all the way through, please share this with your friends if you think they would be interested. I would absolutely adore to have new people come to the channel, even if it's only for this series and they unsubscribe later. If you are watching this content and this is the first video of mine you have ever watched, remember to leave a like and look through my content. Decide if you're interested or not. Look at my YouTube introduction video. See if that intrigues you or not. And as always, for all of you Tesla Cats who are not new here, remember to keep on keeping on. And I will see everyone in the next video. Bye!